Well, in many ways, it's quite interesting because I was somebody who reacted against my mother's attitude. My mother was from North East Wales, and my dad was from Dolgellau, Machynlleth, yeah, and he was a Welsh speaker. My mother was so anti-Welsh. She was, even though she was Welsh, her father was a Welsh speaker from Dunvant, yeah, but she was very anti-Welsh. She always used to say to me, you know, if you want to get on in life, don't bother to speak Welsh, it's backward. You know, speak English with a proper accent and everything. And she hammered that into me, and of course, really, what happened was, of course, I reacted against it. Yeah, I had this bizarre situation where my father was a playwright and a novelist in Welsh, and I didn't understand any of it because my mother was so anti. His name was Tom Richards. He wrote a novel, Morochan y Gysegredig, and he also wrote, well, mainly he's known as a playwright, and he wrote satires, you know, and funny enough, he was one of the first script writers on Publicum, believe it or not, way back when he first started. So yeah, he was very much, he won drama prize at the Eisteddfod and all that sort of stuff, and he's very much into that. And of course I used to go to the Eisteddfod with him, and basically, as I say, I just reacted against my mother's attitude. So by about 1972, I'd worked for Third World First, which is was a charity which did educational work and so on about the Third World. And it was really while I was doing that I came to the conclusion that Wales was actually a colony, because I was involved with looking at colonialism, which, you know, was still around in the late 70s and in the early 70s, in fact, rather. So so I came to that conclusion, and I joined Plaid Cymru around about 72. But by the time, you know, we tried to change it, a number of us, and make it more left-wing and make it more nationalist, but we failed. We were linked with the newspaper Cymru Goch, yeah, and we also had the magazine A Scythe, and that was mainly Robert Griffiths who did that. But we realised we just, you know, let's put it this way, when it came to 1979 and the referendum, I went to the Plaid Cymru conference in 78, which was in Swansea, and argued that we should have nothing to do with the referendum campaign, yeah, and say, no way, you know, we don't want a technical assembly, we want independent. I was saying it then. In fact, the vote was not that bad. It was fairly close. The person who stood up and spoke against me and swung it against me was Emrys Roberts from Merthyr. I mean, yeah. You know, there were a lot of, you know, pretty progressive types, you know, Harry Webb, of course, yes, and people like that, who were, you know, when Plaid Cymru had a newspaper, what was it called? I can't remember. Was it Welsh Republic? I don't know. I can't remember what it was called, but when Harry Webb edited it, it was pretty progressive. It was definitely left of centre, and it was much more nationalist than the main force of Plaid Cymru. So that kind of encouraged me to join Plaid Cymru. But then, as I say, when it got to 1979, you know, they were getting us to go out and put out Labour leaflets, for goodness sake, during the winter there. I remember tramping through snowdrifts up in Penrael, putting out stuff, and I'm thinking, what on earth are we doing? He keeps on saying things like, you know, is this the slippery slope to nationalism? And I thought, well, I would like to believe so, but I'm afraid it's not, you know, in simple language. So, no, it wasn't a good time. And by the time all that had happened and the vote and everything, we were so pissed off. We all went to the Kilmerry celebration, and there was a social in the evening, and that really was where the Welsh Socialist Republican Movement started. There was a guy around those days who died not long afterwards, but he was a real strong, you know, anti-colonialist, an internationalist, had lots of friends who were Latin American and so on, a guy called Phil Henry. And Phil Henry came up to me and said, you know, because he always argued that, you know, I'd argued the right arguments and so on and so forth. So he was in the beginning of the WSRM, but in those days we got all sorts of people. It was quite a big organisation, actually. You know, we had groups, you know, really quite active groups all over. You know, Swansea was Glenn Phillips and Phil Henry and that lot and everything. And but the problem with the WSRM is that it's in the title. Welsh Socialist Republican. Now, there were people in WSRM who wanted to be more Republican, and those who wanted to be more socialist. And I lost a lot of enthusiasm for it towards the end, because we were in a meeting and Robert Griffiths was, I was the trade union officer, and right, we'll now talk about class issues. And I thought, we'll now talk about trade union, it should be central. You know, it really should be central, and which is just a little topic that you can bring up. And of course they were so full of having their marching bands, and you know, they took the idea from the Scottish Socialist Republican Movement, and then originally, of course, from the Irish Republican Movement, but so they had their little marching bands and so on and forth. So we used to go and, you know, march around Abergele and that sort of stuff, and we did the same thing up in Merthyr. We revived the you know, the Dick Penderyn side, and the Merthyr Rising March and everything. We also did marches against holiday homes and everything. Partly because of the sheer frustration of Plaid Cymru taking the wrong position on devolution,
right,
and the referendum.
Yes.
And then also I thought, fucking hell, we're facing Thatcher now.
Yeah.
She's a real vicious bastard. No, we just had enough of Plaid Cymru, to be honest. Some people stayed within the Blaid. I left.
Yeah.
You know, I made my effort within the Blaid, and that was from about 1972. Really, I was active from 74 onwards. 74 was the time of the two elections, general elections. And I'd canvassed for the Blaid up Wrexham Way and also down here and stuff. Partly up Wrexham because I was doing a postgraduate certificate of education in Manchester in university, so it was the nearest to go down to Wrexham to canvass and so on and forth. So, but I'd done that, but as I say, when it came to about 1970, 1980 really, the WSRM started, and it took off a bit. But then, of course, we had this split, as I say, between, in a sense, the Republican and the Socialist, and also, of course, the people who were planting devices, shall we say? Wow was the name given to the people planting the devices.
Yeah.
There was supposed to be a complete division between Wower, people planting devices, and the Welsh Socialist Republican Movement.
Right.
Except there wasn't, as I discovered. Yeah. There was a link, by the way, with Mac. And also, more to the point, in 1980, Mabin Gadur. I mean, you know, I'm not giving anything away, I don't think, to say that there was remarkable similarity between the devices. Yes, there was a guy who infiltrated through the Bridgend WSRM club, and he was from London, and he knew some of the people in Bridgend, and I was looking at him and thinking, oh no, you don't. This is not. He wasn't an agent provocateur. He was a spy. But of course, it didn't have to be that good. So we then had the show trial, didn't we? You know, and I mean, I was surprised at some of the people involved with that. You know, I had suspicions of some of them, but you know, when it actually came to all the raids and everything, they raided me. Yeah, but they never arrested me. I think partly because I was a law lecturer, so I knew my stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. They. I remember once they had a raid at something like 4 o'clock in the morning. I lived in Abertudor in Big Ashley Terrace at the top there, and they came in something like 4 or 5 in the morning, and they had this warrant. And it was part of the Operation Fire thing. I don't know whether you know about that. Yeah. Yeah. Have you read the booklet about it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And what it actually said is the warrant actually said we're looking for stuff to do with devices, but unless you can make paper explode, it wasn't much of that. It was very cursory. What they were interested in is my papers and whether there were any links, or it was a trawling exercise. I mean, well, I remember Rod Barrow, who's dead now, but Rod Barrow was over Nelson Way, Treharris, and he'd stayed with us in Bringelly in Abertudor, and they wanted to take away his Cymdeithas yr Iaith Gymraeg pamphlets. We said, you can buy those, for goodness sake, and buy them in the shop. You know, what do you think this is evidence of, for God's sake? So it was a bit of a joke, to be honest. So anyway, then there was the show trial, and I think there. Oh yes, there was this guy who I was introduced to as Jim Llewellyn, but it actually was David the Lad, and he was the one who'd been involved with the Angry Brigade. I hadn't got the faintest idea. You know, it was a complete surprise to me, and I went, oh, I see. And of course Robert Griffiths and Adrian Stone. So anyway, I mean, there was the show trial, and then it all fell apart. And of course Robert Griffiths went off with Gareth Miles, and they joined the bloody Communist Party. The Brits! Brill! Oh, thank you, Robert. You really stuck to your guns there. Except I was never terribly sure what his guns were, to be honest. He was a research officer for the Blythe. Yeah.
Yeah.
But after that all fell apart, Alan, I think he went off to do other stuff, not terribly political, whatever. So it was only Rod Barron and I left. And we were the socialist wing of the WSRM. I went to visit people on remand in prison, but I really didn't know what had been going on, to be honest. Well, they until the trial, they were in Cardiff jail on remand. But in the final analysis, there was a book written by John
Osmond.
But I think you'd find that some of us would say, take that with a not pinch of salt, a block of salt, because it's really the Robert Griffiths version, which Alan Roberts and I still, very good friends, whatever. He's working, so that's why he isn't able to come to this or whatever. But I've been telling him, come on, we ought to write some of this down, because as far as most people are concerned, it's only what happened according to, Robert Griffiths. And sorry, it wasn't like that at all. I mean, don't forget, he made himself absolutely central to it, and I think that's a mistake. Well, it just wasn't true, But of course, this is the irony, isn't it? I mean, he was somebody who knew what was going on. Yeah? But you wouldn't be able to tell from the book, would you? Yeah? And so yes, he knew all about WOW. Whereas I was more like Welsh Socialist Republican Movement, and so anyway, that fell apart, and we started up in the late 80s then with Cymru Goch. We kept Havana Goch going. We resurrected it, in fact, because it had gone down to about one issue a year. And then we got it back up to one issue a month, and it was a good little magazine. That I write now and again, well, not much anymore, but I have written. I still occasionally write for Private Eye, and we had some bloody good articles. Stuff that was as good as anything in Private Eye. In fact, we used to have stuff nicked out of Havana Goch by Clive Betts, the Western Mail journalist. Yeah, and he'd print it as though it was his own work. Mind you, that happens a lot. And I forget the South Wales Echo did a front page about Welsh water, which came from an article that I'd been writing for Private Eye. I think my proudest letter was a little letter written to Ian Hislop, which Ian Hislop sent on to me, forward Richards with a little note, because this guy was saying, I see that Private Eye warned about Kincoid Park being turned to housing and everything, before the Echo got onto it. And we did too. Oh yes, Phil Thomas.
Right.
He was a law lecturer, professor in fact.
Right.
I knew Phil also because I taught law, and he was chief examiner at one point at the WJC. Yeah, and I used to send a lot of law students off to him. So yes, he did that. Bless him, Phil. And so yeah, but I was active after all that fell apart and everything. I stayed involved in politics, and I was in a unique position because I was giving legal advice to people, and I went over to the NUM in Sardis Road at the beginning of the strike because there were people being arrested with a leaflet to do with scabs, the famous Jack London leaflet about what a scab is. And some of the miners have been putting this out, and they wanted legal advice because they'd been arrested. So I went over to there, and that's when I was over there, they were saying, well, this was early days during the miners' strike. We need miner support groups. So I went and set up the Rumney Valley Miner Support Group. I was chairman of that. I called a meeting in Caerphilly Workmen's Hall. And to be fair, Plaid Cymru were very good locally. They really were. They were just as good, if not better in some ways, than Labour. People like Lindsay Whittle, Judith Pritchard and others. And they were really, those were the left-wingers in the Plaid, yeah? I'm still in touch with Lindsay. I've got a lot of time for Lindsay. He's a real working class bloke. And there was old Tommy Hopkins, who was the Communist Party down by the Bowls, and he got me the Miners' Workmen's Hall, and then we got Labour together. I got Labour in because in 1978 I'd been involved in the campaign to save Nat Garrow coking ovens, giving legal advice and helping out with publicity. Yeah. So I knew some of the people, some of the miners. Yeah? So it was fairly easy for me to call together people I knew, and Labour and Plaid Cymru, and I called a meeting together in Workmen's Hall, and I spoke and everything and said we need to get organised and so on and so forth. And I said, well, we'll need officers now. And I said, but I've done my bit, I've called the meeting, so we'll need a chairman, a secretary and a treasurer. I said, right, who should be the chairman? And they all said, you. Really? Yeah, you called the meeting together, you chaired it. And of course I was in a good position because I wasn't in the Plaid Cymru in those days, I'd left. Yeah? But I was known amongst the left-wingers. Yeah? So I was in a very good position. I was trusted as a left-winger who's, not Plaid Cymru, not Labour, but in the middle. So in some ways that was why they chose me as chairperson. Yeah? And then there was Frank Cuthbert, who was the treasurer, and he was militant, and Colin Matthews, who was Labour Party. So yes, there was the miners' strike and everything. And as I say, after that finished, that's when we started up Cymru Goch. And as I say, we were very active against the poll tax. We definitely had this thing about, it's no good just talking about the politics of it, you've got to help. So we used to go to the magistrates' courts, and I got slung out of Bargoed Magistrates Court, and I got slung out of Aberdare Magistrates Court, ordered out. It's quite bizarre actually, but yes, Cymru Goch was very active like that, and but then you see it was an interesting thing because the anti-poll tax movement was a mixture of old-fashioned Communist Party and Cymru Goch and various other people who weren't anything in particular, and on the other side of the coin was militant. And what's very, very interesting is how badly wrong the Socialist Worker Party got it. They were not involved at all. Yeah, because they used to get their orders from London, and they really didn't get into it. They didn't understand it. They you know, our attitude was, well, this is going to be the miners' revenge over Thatcher. And it was. In the final analysis. So I know they go on about Geoffrey Howe and Europe and so on and so forth, but that's not what it did for her. It was a poll tax. Yeah? And we were a small part of all that. Yeah? But there were people who, you know, I did a lot because of the law side. I did a lot of the legal arguments. And there were other people who weren't in any particular political party, but who were left-wing, and they did legal stuff and everything. So, and of course, we all learnt from Scotland. People forget this, don't they? You know, the poll tax started, the opposition started in Scotland. Yeah? But it was pretty active in Wales. You know, and Cymru Goch, there were people all over. Up in Wrexham and places like that, Mark Jones and people like that. Cheyenne Horse and quite a few others. So, Mike Jenkins, the poet. In fact, that's the funny thing about Cymru Goch, is, you know, it folded in the end, but its legacy was the Red Poets. I suppose if you can have a legacy from a political party, then having a poetry booklet is not a bad legacy, is it? You know, and that's still going. It's his 20th issue coming out in later this month.
And Forward Wales as well.
Ah, well, Forward Wales, we really got screwed there, because John Marrick has been having a big bust up because he was deselected up in North Wales, and we met with him and said, and it was Mark actually who said, look, you know, let's we're not getting anywhere with Cymru Goch, let's join Forward Wales. But we got screwed. I mean, it's only after we joined that we discovered that Ron Davis had joined. You know, I don't care a fuck about Ron Davis's sexuality. It's his total lack of political principles that pisses me off. Yeah? And when I discovered that, I thought, oh no. So anyway, that finished off Cymru Goch, and then Forward Wales imploded. They weren't really terribly political though. You know, Cymru Goch was very political and putting together arguments and everything. And I think they ran scared of us. And of course, Marrick ended up with the Tories, didn't he? Well, I mean, when Cymru Goch folded, a few people did join Plaid Cymru.
Yeah.
And then recently, when Leanne Wood stood, I rejoined, not with any great enthusiasm, but I thought I'd be a hypocrite if I didn't, because she was pro-Republican, not perfect, but she was definitely left-wing, and she was the only person who I remember in Plaid Cymru who actually talked about independence, and to be fair to her, she's still talking about it. And for that reason I thought, well, I left Plaid Cymru because it wasn't nationalist enough, it wasn't socialist enough, and it wasn't Republican. And I thought I'd be a bloody hypocrite if I didn't rejoin, and at least vote for Leanne.
Yeah.
You know, and I say I've got no great illusions. Yeah. But it's a lot damn better than it was when I was in the Blythe in the 70s. You see, what was interesting, and I know about this, the number of people on the left and Republican outside of Plaid Cymru was huge. An awful lot of them then joined Plaid Cymru to vote for Leanne. Yeah, quite.
Yeah.
And I say, without any illusions, but what the you know, and don't underestimate it, yeah? I mean, you know, there's some people quite rightly point out, she's, not perfect. I'm thinking, I've got to say to myself, do you actually expect perfection? Let's have a little bit of pragmatism about this, And I've got more faith now that, as far as I can see it, the political map is going to change. And it'll change on September the 18th. Yeah?
Yeah.
We see the polls going that way. And when I was teaching in college, I retired a couple of years ago, I used to teach politics towards the end. Yeah? I had mature students. And it was quite interesting because I was predicting, even before the referendum was proposed, I said it's fairly obvious the direction that Scotland's going. What if Scotland became independent? Would it have an effect? And a student, I don't know. Would it affect your view? I don't know. I said, right, let me ask you this. If Scotland goes independent, we in Wales are stuck with a permanent Tory majority. Now what do you think? And do you know, fascinating. They went, oh. I said, would that change your view? And I think it might.
Yeah.
Then thought it through.
Yes.
As I had.
I mean, so they might have to come around to the position you had 30 years ago.
I think that, yes. In the simple language, if, as I expect, Scotland votes yes, then it'll take a little while, right? But once the dust clears, then I think people will start to wake up to the reality. And the reality for us in Wales on one level is awful, right? But another level, it is, you don't make an omelette without breaking eggs. I mean, yeah, but in those days, in the original days, there was a real internationalism. I had some respect for it. Yeah? I mean, to be honest, Labour's changed so much over the years. There used to be some right old bloody, Labour hacks around in the valleys, or, I think the MPs like Fred Evans and stuff. But you still had Labour MPs that I had some respect for because they'd come from a working class background. Yeah? And, that was significant. Not these days, it's just a professional organisation. Yeah? And, you get kind of political people coming through because, they've worked their way up, so to speak. Yeah? And, they're full-time politicians. It affects them. It definitely affects them. And, the way in which they view politics and so on and so forth. So, I think that it's an interesting point because my theory has always been, like this too, by the way, about, I say this to my my lady friend Meg. She's a big, strong person for Plaid, but then it's a family thing. She's actually the granddaughter of T.E. Ellis. Her father was Richard Ellis, yeah, and he was the son of T.E. Ellis, yeah. So, scion of the establishment, so to speak. And sure, she's a member of the Gorsedd, blah 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 blah, whatever. So even when I wasn't in the Plaid, when she stood for Plaid Cymru up in Delyn, I went and canvassed for her, and I even went and canvassed for the Plaid, you know, before I rejoined. Because, you know, I mean, let's put it this way, they were better than Labour. It's got to the stage where that is. But the point is that politics in Wales is very much linked to Westminster. So the Plaid always does better in Welsh Assembly elections when there's been a Labour government. Because that's what, when people go to Labour or whatever, and they get into government, that's when people feel, in a sense, free to vote for Plaid Cymru. And so working class people in the valleys who are still well to the left of you know, politics in England, yeah, not necessarily north of England, right?
Yeah.
But generally speaking, yeah, well to the left. They're going to have to do a lot of thinking. And I see, the Plaid is definitely, in terms of Abertudor, for instance, we've got 3 Plaid Cymru councillors here, yeah, and basically I think a lot of people are happy with voting for the Plaid Cymru ones because they're as left-wing, if not more left-wing, than the Labour ones. And so it's not, it's all, voting for Plaid Cymru or voting for Labour to do with a general election or whatever, are becoming more, what's the word, complicated, of course, because of UKIP. But I think in the end, you know, Labour is so right-wing these days, yeah, that it's becoming something which slowly but surely people are beginning to wake up to. And that's something that Meg is amazed by, the fact, you know, that you've got this Welsh medium education. Funny enough, of course, my boys went to Welsh medium education, and my wife was English, but she was a French teacher, and she always believed it was a good thing for the boys to have 2 languages because they'd find it easier to do a third. And of course, Welsh is a pretty European language when all's said and done. It's not, you know, it's a much bigger gap between Welsh and English than between Welsh and French. Yeah? Even when it comes to vocabulary. You know, Ffenestr, Ffenetr, and, you know, Cheval, Ceffyl, you know, blah, blah, blah. So, no, I don't think in the valleys it's a pressure group for obviously it's connected to the Welsh language, yeah, but it's interesting that I mean, Meg actually is got a contract translating Welsh English, yeah, with Plaid Cymru, and I don't honestly think everything we get through the door from Plaid Cymru is bilingual these days. I don't think anybody particularly notices one way or the other. It doesn't really impact on them, you know. I mean, if anything, in the valleys, what's the motivation to send your child to a Welsh school? But the feeling that you've missed out on something. Yeah? I'll never forget, Rod Barra was a Welsh speaker, and I lived in Treharris Way and so on and forth. And when he was learning, well, when he was speaking Welsh, whatever, back in the 70s, he went round a lot of the old people, right, who were the original Welsh speakers. They weren't people who moved in, yeah? And he found, you know, he started listening to the words they were using, yeah, and they were very much like that. So my own father, you know, was Welsh speaking and everything. I think I find an awful lot of people around here are 1 generation or 2 generations off, yeah, from Welsh. And, you know, there's not There certainly isn't what I'd call, not in the valleys. I couldn't speak for Cardiff, I don't live there, but certainly in the valleys I don't think there's any particular anti-Welsh thing. Or if you come across it, then it's most likely the incomers.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a famous character from Abertudo who went off to Spain to fight with the Republicans. He's called Jack Rusher. Yeah? Because he was the Communist Party councillor and he got re-voted in as Communist Party councillor while he was over in Spain. Yeah? And he was from North Wales and he was a Welsh speaker. You know, when I was a little boy, every seat in Wales was Labour. Except maybe there'd be one Liberal. Yeah? But otherwise, you know, Megan Lloyd George, I think, you know. But otherwise, everything was Labour and everything. And of course, that we're talking about Gwynedd and so on and forth, Welsh speaking, and everything like that. Yeah? So what's happened up in North Wales is that in Fro Cymraeg, you know, you'd probably still get that thrown up there or whatever, but of course it doesn't really work that well, does it? You know, I mean, who was a member of the Crachach? Well, you could argue David Wigley, yeah, because he'd worked for Hoover, yeah, and a couple of others like that, but it very much in a Fro Cymraeg. You know, North East Wales. I mean, people forget about North East Wales. It's got a lot more in common with the valleys. Partly because of the coal mining. You know, my uncle was a miner in Bersham. Yeah? And during the miners' strike, his Point of Air was the last pit, but it was still there. I say, I can only speak as I find. I don't talk about Cardiff because I don't live there. I can only speak as I find Abertudo. And I've never seen that argument. I never heard it. Maybe in the old days might have been, but that's 30, 40 years ago. An awful lot has changed since then. Here's an interesting book. It's an old book, but that's what in fact makes it interesting. When was it? 1960s? 70s? Yeah, 1970s. 1971. What Madgwick did with Don Griffiths and Barry Walker was they did an analysis of the political parties in the rural areas. Yeah, it might be worth having a look at politics of rural Wales. 1970. And what I found fascinating about that was that the class structure of Plaid Cymru and Labour in rural areas, in their branches, were pretty much the same. Actually. So I do sometimes wonder about, you know, accusations like that, whether they really hold up. I mean, you know, it's like, there's a few myths around, isn't there? There's a werin. I've always regarded a werin as being a myth. A werin doesn't exist. You know, it's kind of one of these muddy phrases, the kind of thing that fudges proper class distinctions. I remember arguing about that many years ago, that the werin just didn't exist. It was an invented concept. I'll be honest with you, it's largely my politics.
Yeah.
And what I got into. And our political philosophy was, well, socialism from below. It's not terribly unique, but you know, for me, the most important political document to come out of Wales, I don't know whether you've read it, is the Miners' Next Step. So this is the argument for socialism from below. It's not really the it's not really the kind of, oh, what's the word? Right, I'll sum it up by saying this. There were quite often with Cymru Goch, we used to debate whether we actually were a political party at all. Yeah, we just didn't operate like one. Maybe because we were too small. Yeah, but we had lots of fellow travellers and stuff. Yeah, and I mean, the ideas here were, as I say, come from that kind of background of the Miners' Next Step. Well, it's mentioned there. Yeah. I mean,
Was that so syndicalist, is it, or?
well, yes, but we realised that what, in the old days, at the time of the Miners' Next Step, syndicalism was actually quite practical. We didn't believe that it was that practical today, because in the old days, the lodge was the industry. Yeah, if you take over the lodge, you're taking over the industry. Yeah? So, I mean, we weren't foolish enough to believe that in 1996. Let me just... Hello?
Hello. Hello.
Hello?
Yeah, hi sir. This is John calling from technical department of your broadband. How are you?
Sorry, who are you?
And this is John calling from technical department of your broadband. How are you?
Oh, sorry, I'm in the middle of a discussion. I'm being interviewed, so I'll put the phone down if you don't mind. It's... Right, let's just talk about it. There's the institutions of Scotland, right? Which never existed in Wales, like the banks. All right, we had Julian Hodge, but that was just a joke. Educational system. Never underestimate the importance of the fact that the Scots have always had their own educational system. Yeah? And that is highly significant. I think to a certain extent too is that it's the history. It was an act of union that was a real union in the sense that there was a Scottish Parliament. Never was in Wales. I mean, the border of Wales is completely arbitrary. It was chosen between 1536 and 38 quite arbitrarily, so that some parts of England were strongly Welsh speaking until the 19th century. Places around Herefordshire and so on and so forth, yeah? And it was purely to do with the diocese. Yeah? And that's the religious border, yeah? So Wales was incorporated into England, which never happened with Scotland because they had their own Scottish Parliament for hundreds of years, and therefore also the separate institutions and so on and forth. You know, there was Scottish currency, Scottish banks, Scottish educational system, and I think that, you know, for me, that's the whole thing. The Act of Union for Wales was 1536, 1538. Well, hang on, that's a long time before the Act of Union with Scotland, yeah? In some ways, it's quite remarkable that Wales still exists. actually. You know, we got swallowed up. In my opinion, we were the first colony of England. Sorry, Ireland, you were second, but we were the first. Yeah? Get off our backs. I wonder if I've still got that. But I did a class history of Wales. And one really interesting thing was the economy of Wales in the 19th century was almost the exact opposite of the English economy. So that when England was in recession, Wales was doing quite well, and when Wales was in recession, England was doing quite well. Yeah? And an awful lot of it was to do with the flow of capital. Yes, there were early Welsh capitalists, but not much after about the middle of the 19th century, because by the time they were sinking the pits then, you had to have far more capital to sink deeper, and so you found that the capital was coming in from all over. But if you look at industry, I mean, the copper smelting in Swansea, Cornish, Derbyshire, that's where the capitalists came from, yeah? And that was largely true throughout the Industrial Revolution. So although we did have our David Davis, Llandinam and so on and so forth, and we had a little bit of that to do with to steel, but even, you know, even that got taken over in the final analysis. So, as I say, the more capital there was required, the more it was going to be foreign capital. Yeah? So, and this is what I'm saying again about Scotland. You know, they had their own capitalists, etc. We never had a Welsh capitalist class. You know, we had individuals, I say, like David Davis or whatever, but, you know, who built bloody Cardiff and Barry and so on, the bloody Bute family? Probably the most interesting document ever produced when I was a young man about the Welsh economy was, I don't know whether you ever heard of it, Phil Williams's study of the branch capitalism and so on and so forth. And he was an intellectual. I mean, tell you what, he was a heavyweight, was old Phil. And, you know, that was probably the best document I remember coming out of Plaid Cymru in those days. Because he really did his stuff. And basically it's fundamentally the same now. Except, of course, what's happened in more recent times, it's not so much English, Welsh, it's Japanese and various, you know, international firms or whatever. You know, but we tend to forget that. Christ almighty, you know. People shouldn't. You know, you've got the oil giants down in Milford Haven Way and so on and so forth. But I used to live in Swansea. And, you know, people who made sellotape, 3Ms. That's a Canadian firm. And then, well, there was Fams of Europe down Llantrisant making the oil filters, the air filters and stuff. And if you actually sat down and did an up-to-date survey of the parent companies of in industry in South Wales, overwhelmingly European, Far East, American. Christ almighty, when I was a little boy, I used to go up and stay with my Uncle Ken and Auntie Mo. She was an orthopaedic nurse, Uncle Ken was the miner in Berksham, and they lived in Trevor, which is right next to Kevin Mauer, and Monsanto's. And I was in the 30s. God, that place used to stink. You look at some of those places, Baglan, they wouldn't cite a fucking chemical works right in the middle of a community these days, but they did in those days. You know? And, so yeah, it's It's a fundamental, it's a given. Well, fundamentally it comes down to taxation on public spending. I went to the Silk Commission, right, and there was a went over Llantrisant Way, and it was a right joke, that was, because I was sat there and there was more members of the Silk Commission than there was members of the public at the beginning, and so I said my little bit, you know, and then I thought, oh, sod this, I've got to throw it all in. And one of the points I said, of course, is if you're talking about all of this taxation, and the big question is what you're going to spend it on. And I said, like that, right? We could immediately cut a vast amount of it, the public expenditure, by not having an army or an air force. You look at defence as part of the British, you know, the UK budget. It's fucking huge. What's the point in us having a fucking army or a fucking air force? I'll have a few helicopters for rescue and stuff like that, you know, and that'll be it. And look at the bloody money you save. It's huge. Yeah? And then energy. Not just energy, water. If we had independence, sorry Severn Trent, you're going to start fucking paying now. Yeah? We just nationalise all the fucking water and then charge them. That would be a nice little earner as well. And then taxation on the companies. Not so stupid as to scare them off or whatever, but you know, the wages of Welsh labour force are lower than in England and so forth, so we could still soak them for a bit because it will still be profitable. You know, they haven't come in here to give us jobs. Yeah? So, yes, I think it's a load of bollocks. I think that argument from people who don't really understand economics, to be perfectly blunt. You know, you could argue, actually, quite an interesting argument, you could actually argue that the British economy is fundamentally weak because so much of it is service sector. Yeah, there's not much fucking industry left in England. You know, they managed to get rid of, you know, so much. I mean, Thatcher ruined British industry or English industry, absolutely ruined it. And so they're now importing whatever. You know, take energy for God's sake. You know, I mean, we could. Energy, I think, in the future is going to be inevitably more and more important, and we can produce energy, without a doubt. I wouldn't be surprised if there is oil off in the Celtic Sea, but no point going and looking at that until the price of oil goes so up through the roof that it might become profitable to look at it, but I'm not depending on something like that. But yes, economically I'm convinced of it. Because as I say, it's not just a matter of income, it's also a matter of expenditure. And I mean, that's something I've written about in the past. The big joke, isn't it? The Severn Bridge. How are they going to pay for all this electrification? Yeah? Well, I know what Labour thinks. I'm convinced of it. They're going to say, right, there are 2 Severn Bridges. We will split, right, the stuff, the tolls or whatever, and we'll use the tolls to pay for an awful lot of this stuff. I don't think the tolls will go in 2018. They might come down a bit, but they could get the tolls down and still get the same income, because once it's public, then they don't have to pay VAT. I mean, you know, people don't understand these things. I remember when they finally just realised that they were going to have to pay VAT. And I did some articles of Private Eye on that, because it came as a complete surprise to them. Oh, should we be paying VAT? Yes, it's private. Oh, what a deal that fucking was. You know what the Severn Bridge was? It was the very first PFI project. The very first one anywhere in Britain. What a fucking scam. Huge earner. I never done personal politics either. It's too childish. Issues are, unless of course it's, you know, somebody like Ron Davis, whose politics just swings around, you know. He's still with Plaid Cymru at the moment, but God knows where he'll end up. Probably want to become a lord, wouldn't he? Actually, I could have admit, when it came to the elections, right, I voted for Lindsay for the regional, but I wouldn't vote for Ron in the constituency. I didn't want him to get in. And I was absolutely delighted when they got Lindsay in on the regionals and Ron Davis wasn't in. I went, good. Because, yeah, it's just, you know, from that to that to that to that. I mean, I've been consistent. I remember when I rejoined the Plaid a couple of years ago to vote for Leanne, and there were some of the old Plaid Cymru councillors, and I said, oh, you come back to us. I said, what do you mean? I said, I haven't come back to you. Oh, yes, you have. You've been away. No, I said. Plaid Cymru went away from me. Now it's come back to me. And I explained it to them. They didn't like that. I left in 1979, 1980, and I said I rejoined in order to vote for Leanne a few years back, but you know, no big deal. I think whether it is Leanne or whatever, the trend is in her direction, or rather in the direction of what we've been talking about. You know, if Scotland goes, then sorry, Plaid Cymru just cannot keep on playing that old game of